it's true that the Russians are making incremental gains in the Pokrovsk area, and there have been evacuations now. The Ukrainians are saying they have to leave within 2 weeks in a town of 53,000 people. It's possible that that area will fall, and Russia will get a significant logistical advantage. But Russia does not have a history, aside from Mariupol, of taking over large cities inside Ukraine with any degree of pace. So moving on to Sloviansk and Kramatorsk is going to be a long slog. I think the Russians believe that they can carry out some kind of a surprise blitz in Donetsk and force the Ukrainians to withdraw, and that's their strategy right now. But I don't think that that's necessarily that feasible. So I think the Russians will have to go back to those two very unpalatable choices: surrender your momentum in eastern Ukraine, or start mobilizing a lot more people.
Sounds like you're saying the Russians are still in denial.
I think the Russians are still in denial. They're still scrambling on how to adjust, and they're still also scrambling on how to adjust in a way that promotes a sense of normalcy at home, especially after the initial propaganda was that this is nothing much to worry about. So the Russian Telegram channels, when they first said there was nothing much to worry about, were kind of being a bit guarded, but critical in their own way. They were like saying the Russians have finally sent Rosguardia and regular forces. How many times do you use the word finally in one paragraph to make that point, right? That was, I think, Oleg Saryev who made that kind of post. And others were kind of urging, saying the situation was very grave. That was like their way of criticizing it. I think that if the situation lasts longer, being in denial and trying to promote a mood of normalcy is not going to satisfy the clued-in ultranationalist bloggers who populate the Telegram space.
You mentioned the bridges a moment ago, Samuel. I wanted to ask you about that because Ukraine has now destroyed the third and final bridge linking the occupied part of the Kursk region to the rest of the oblast. How significant is that? And I mean, you've got Russia playing it down almost, saying, look, we've been able to establish pontoons, so it doesn't really matter. Again, is that Russia being in denial, or how would you evaluate the significance of dropping those bridges?
Well, I think it's very significant. I think it's also, again, the risk of Russia being in denial, because how many times did the Russians talk about their pontoon ferries and their temporary crossings in Kherson in the months leading up to the collapse of Kherson in November of 2022, right? From August to November 2022, that was exactly what they were talking about. All these kind of pontoons and ferries and alternative supply routes to replace the bridges. But once the Ukrainians got the Antonovsky Bridge, there was not much the Russians could do. So I think that this is looking like a repeat of the military failures that we saw in Kherson with regards to the bridges, and the initial Ukrainian incursion into Kursk is looking a lot like the undermanned positions in Kharkiv that had to flee in September of 2022. So this setback in Kursk is reminding the Russians, even if they don't want to admit it, of their two most humiliating defeats of this war: that withdrawal from Kherson and that withdrawal from Kharkiv.
Wanted to get your thoughts as well, Samuel, on a conversation we were having on yesterday's episode of Frontline with the former British Army Colonel, now military analyst Hamish de Bretton Gordon, and he was saying he thinks it's feasible that we will see Ukraine launch further cross-border attacks into Russia in the coming weeks and months, given the success of the Kursk incursion. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think it's very possible. I think that there was some reporting yesterday, and the Economist picked up on it, that Kursk was not the only region where the Ukrainians thought that they could make an advance. The Ukrainians were also looking quite seriously at Bryansk. And Bryansk was an area where they were shelling even in middle of 2022. And that was one of the first regions, actually, of Russia where the Ukrainians actually struck and tried to bring the war to the Russians, right? So there's a possibility that they could do something in Bryansk. There's a possibility that they could do something in Belgorod. I have a feeling that the Russians were most prepared for the Belgorod scenario, which is why there have been so many evacuations and sealing off of territory as unsafe. They figured that Belgorod would be the natural antidote to striking Kharkiv, whereas Kursk would be the natural antidote to striking Sumy. They had done more damage to Kharkiv, so they expected more from Belgorod. But I think that if the Ukrainians go somewhere else, they will trick the Russians again and hit Bryansk rather than hit Belgorod again.
How much is the impression that ordinary Russians are getting of this incursion matter? I mean, obviously, you've got hundreds of thousands of people who've now been evacuated from their homes in the Kursk Oblast and Belgorod as well. So they'll clearly be noticing what Ukraine are doing. But is it feeding back to other ordinary Russians across the country? And does that matter?
Well, I think it is starting to hit home to some degree, because any Russian who is even somewhat clued in on Telegram is pretty clear that what they're hearing from their government is not exactly what's actually happening. even if they don't know all the details, they know the situation is much more serious than what it looks like. And what we're seeing right now, obviously, is Russian state, Russia One, Ria Novosti, kind of going in overdrive and basically talking about how there's some kind of a rift between the Westerns and the governments and the Ukrainians over this. On the one hand, like the Ukrainians are going too far and they're going to lose support. On the other hand, they're saying that this is a terror attack that really was originated in the decision making centers in London or the decision making centers in Washington. They can't really even seem to get their story straight on whether the Ukrainians are good, obedient proxies or whether the Ukrainians are kind of rogue neo Nazi criminals who the West are as offended by as they are. So, as long as their state media puts out this firehouse of falsehoods that really don't make any sense to anybody, and people have access to Telegram, they don't have access to Signal very much anymore because the Russians are cracking down on that. But and encrypted communication, encrypted photos are being cracked down on. But as long as they have access to Telegram, as long as they're seeing what's the chaos that's going on in their information space, they can probably put two and two together and realize that this is something that we haven't seen before.
Yeah, and again, that's a really good point because, again, this is a chance for Ukraine to win the information war in terms of the way Ukrainian troops behave in Russia in comparison to the way Russian troops have been behaving in Ukraine. There was a fascinating piece in the Sunday Times over the weekend where one of our journalists had been speaking to some of the Russian prisoners who'd been captured, some of the conscripts. They were being held in a detention center in Sumy. And they were saying, look, we were terrified when we came here because we'd heard all these stories, all this propaganda about being tortured by the Ukrainians. Actually, we've been treated very well. We've had great medical treatment. Some of the guards have spent their own money buying us cigarettes and water and pastries. And so that provides an opportunity for Ukraine to further win the information war.
Exactly. I think that is something that can be done quite readily. I think the fact that the Ukrainian incursions in Kursk, the Russians keep talking about how it's an act of terrorism against residential areas, how the bridges were killing volunteers or helping people evacuate. They're trying to push the narrative that the Ukrainians are absolutely brutal and are indiscriminate in the massacre of civilians there. It does not seem as if the Ukrainian attacks on Kursk are inflicting anywhere near the kind of civilian damage and the kind of harm that the Russian attacks on so many major cities are doing. So the Ukrainians can occupy territory without massacring civilians and without destroying almost every building in their sight. They can get some kind of a clear moral high ground over Russia that maybe even the Russians, with all the propaganda that's fitting them, might be able to see through and accept.
Just finally, Samuel, if you're Vladimir Putin, what's the worst case scenario from here? What else could go wrong for him in the coming weeks?
Well, I think the worst case scenario would probably be the Ukrainians manage to expand from Kursk and launch additional axes, just like what Hamish was talking about, just like what we were just discussing earlier. I think that would be a real quandary for the Russian military campaign. It might force them to move towards the obviously the prospect of greater and more enhanced mobilization, which is something that he's been resisting and he hasn't wanted to do. I think that also as Putin gets more and more desperate, we have to play a very close eye on what's happening with the nuclear power plants because the Russian Foreign Ministry has already said that the Kursk nuclear power plant and the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant are under attack by Ukrainian forces. And there have been reports, obviously, of some fires in the Zaporizhia plant. It's unclear. Obviously, the Zaporizhia plant has been partially disabled. It's unclear whether they have the fuel there that would be necessary to cause a nuclear meltdown or not. But electricity needs to keep flowing into that plant for it to work, for it to ever work again, and for it to stay cool. So cutting one of those electrical wires could be enough. So there's obviously a lot of things that Putin has to worry about. And I think that we should be worried about Putin getting more and more desperate right now and maybe doing something with the nuclear plants. I don't think his desperation will rise to the level, though, that we will see a nuclear strike.
Thank you for watching Frontline for Times Radio. For more on global security and the war in Ukraine, you can listen to Times Radio, take out a digital subscription to the Times, and click subscribe on our YouTube channel.